my name is Jacob Mayberry. I'm originally from Arizona. I actually grew up about an hour north of the Mexican border. And I'm currently living in Utah right now in Magna, which is pretty close to Salt Lake City. I work in the Utah State Prison, and I have a master's degree in criminal justice, a bachelor's degree in psychology, and I'm currently getting my PhD in criminal justice. I make some content on YouTube defending the church against criticism from people who attack the church from a social scientific perspective predominantly, but I also do it from like a scriptural point of view as well. I have a YouTube channel called Actual Mormons. I co-host it with Bridger Coburn. We haven't posted anything there recently. We hope to get started on that again. But yeah, that's my general background.
Perfect, Jacob. And it was actually watching one of the Actual Mormon videos that I got the idea to contact you to talk about this. You were mentioning in that video that you've been thinking about doing a presentation on cult models, and you know, if I got a penny every time I hear the word cult and Mormon or LDS used in the same sentence, maybe I could even purchase the City Creek Mall. So quite a few times.
Yep.
So this presentation will be pretty interesting. But I'm excited to get started. So, the time is yours. So where should we start?
Yeah, for sure. So if I could just share my screen, and we'll get started on talking about like obviously the most famous person that in the anti-cult movement is Stephen Hassan. He's the one that gets brought up the most in the bite model. He's the one that came up with it, but that didn't start in a vacuum. So a few years ago, Dr. Dan McClellan, he makes some good content on TikTok. He came out and talked about cult models and how they are now valid ways of evaluating religion. And it made a big waves on TikTok. A lot of people didn't like it. So I'm just going to share what he had to say as kind of like a primer for what I'm about to talk about. And then there'll be a few other scholars as well. There's Dr. Hillel Gray. He's a religious studies scholar. And then also David Frankfurter, who ironically, he was on the Mormon Stories YouTube channel being interviewed by Dr. John DeLynn. They're both talking about what they think about cult models and Stephen Hassan's work. So,
everybody, I continue to see a lot of discussion on social media about cults, and I just want to remind you all that this is not a legitimate scholarly framework. Cult, brainwashing, mind control, deprogramming, these things were all abandoned by scholars back in the early 90s after the courts asked cult experts to substantiate their methods and their findings, and they failed entirely. This is why the only scholars you will see publishing on the concept of cult these days are scholars from the 80s who are trying to remain relevant. So Stephen Hassan's bite model was developed back in 88. It was abandoned by scholars along with everything else, but after 9/11, after the rise of Trump, these scholars try to ride that wave of populist anxiety back into the public eye. And this is harmful for a number of reasons, and not least of which, it complicates our attempts to understand what's actually going on with these groups that are causing significant harm. Hey, happy to elaborate. The conceptualization of cult that I critique in my video is a product of the 1960s and the development of two social movements in tandem that were made up of parents who were upset about their teenage and adult children running off into the woods with hippies to talk about weird stuff. In the Christian community, you had the counter-cult movement. In the non-religious community, you had the anti-cult movement. And one of their priorities was finding a way to assert control over their adult children who could join any groups they wanted. And what they did to facilitate that was went to long since debunked research about Korean War POWs and how they had to have been brainwashed and been under mind control to sympathize with their captors. This has long since been debunked, but the counter and anti-cult movement gladly took up that research and said people who join with these weirdos in the woods cannot be of sound mind. They must have been brainwashed. They are under mind control. This allowed them to get medical professionals involved. It allowed them to commit people. It allowed them to take over control of the lives of their adult children, which was the goal all along. Now, because brainwashing isn't real, deprogramming, their method of reversing the effects of brainwashing, also wasn't real. So they were constantly having to escalate their techniques to try to make it work. And this resulted in the 80s with a bunch of kidnappings, with sexual abuse, with electroshock therapy, and a lot of harmful behavior that mirrored what they were criticizing in the cults themselves. So scholars began to become alarmed. They started to investigate the foundations of these frameworks and found out that there was nothing there. There was no scientific basis to brainwashing, to mind control. And the bottom fell out. The courts stopped allowing them to use brainwashing and mind control as a way to absolve themselves of responsibility for their actions. And by 1995, these movements were all but defunct, which is why you don't see scholars these days talking about cults and mind control, except for scholars like Stephen Hassan from the 80s trying to relive the glory days. The rise of Trump increased interest among lay people and society in general about cults, and this allowed him to ride that populist wave into a PhD program where he finally wrote his dissertation and got his PhD in 2020, even though the BITE model dates to the 80s. Now, this is not to say that such groups were not capable of harmful behavior and that there were not power dynamics and different techniques of manipulation that led to harmful behavior. There were absolutely such harmful behaviors, but the dynamics associated with them are not found in this conceptualization of cult. They're much broader, and we need to do better to understand them.
Yeah, that's not true, my friend.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It doesn't mean every single person who is a scholar agrees, but it is overwhelmingly the consensus, and the argument is sound.
Here's a class you can take at Harvard University on cult psychology.
Yes, universities, including Harvard, still have courses like this on the books. These are courses that the university has and assigns to professors who, for the most part, are not specialists in this and are teaching it only because they're capable of teaching this. And for instance, if you go look at the professors who teach this course at Harvard and have taught it in the past and look at their CVs, you will not find the word cult anywhere in their publications or in their research. They tend not to be specialists in new religious movements. But if you look at the specialists in new religious movements that Harvard does have, you will find them saying cult is an outdated term. We don't use this. Deprogramming, brainwashing are not a thing. However, we do recognize that a lot of people use cult because that it helps them make sense of their past experiences. And so they will respect that term even though they don't prefer it, they don't use it in the scholarship, and they don't think of it as a legitimate scholarly framework. So it's a lot more complicated than this. I am sharing the overwhelming academic consensus. I am not telling you every last scholar on the planet believes this, and if anyone doesn't, they're lying.
The only people who don't think it's a legitimate study are people in cults. Like if you belong to the Mormon church. Which, let's get real, that's what this is really about, right?
No, that's not remotely what this is about, but I understand that that is an easy assumption to make. I am sharing the overwhelming academic consensus. You can look at a bunch of resources to find this out. You can look at the journal Nova Religio. You can look at the International Journal for the Study of New Religions. You can go look at the Oxford Handbook of New Religious Movements. Rutledge has a whole series on new religious movements. Cambridge does as well. You can find all kinds of scholarship out there that demonstrates what I'm sharing is the scholarly consensus. But to suggest that because Harvard has a course with the word cult in the title and in the course description means that no one thinks this is an inappropriate scholarly category except for those who are in cults is just laughably lazy. Please do better.
Perhaps I should be flattered that you called me a cult apologist, and I wouldn't bother responding except sometimes on social media if you say something enough people start to believe it. Scholars refrain from disparaging or condemning religious groups, and that's why we use a term like new religious movement rather than cult. Scholars don't deny that there can be abuse, manipulation, and corruption in all sorts of new religious movements, as well as older religious movements. Cult is a poorly defined, biased term that is associated with some outdated, even unscientific notions, like brainwashing. I'm not an apologist for my own religion, so I'm certainly not going to be one for new religious movements. When it comes to publishing in academic journals and doing scientific research, I'm confident that the scholars in new religious movements outnumber by far those who are in the anti-cult movement. So there isn't parity between these two groups. I'm not doubting that you have suffered from your family's involvement in the Unification Church, but I want to show you that there are plenty of religious scholars who do study the Unification Church without calling them a cult. And so I'll show you some images from the articles that have been published in recent years.
The other thing that came out in the 60s was a resurgence of anxiety about so-called brainwashing. Now, brainwashing has no psychological basis, but it arose during the Korean War as a way of fomenting fears about POWs. But this was given a whole new life with during the 60s and 70s with the deprogrammer movement. That is, experts in evil, in this case, experts who could kidnap your child from a group and subject your child to extreme deprivation and violence in order to convince him or her that they shouldn't be part of the group. And the idea was that what they claimed, the deprogrammers, was that they were breaking the brainwashing that the group did. Brainwashing became an important aspect of the satanic ritual abuse claims. The idea was that these rituals functioned to hypnotize and brainwash the abuse victims. So not only were they victims of sexual abuse, they were victims of programming and deprogramming, programming and brainwashing. So I would say that was one major thread that came into SRA. And the other was the notion of the cult itself. The cult as a kind of folk model of dangerous religion. I don't use the word cult when I teach, and even when I teach about new religious movements, I don't let I try to get the students away from the word cult. I tell them at a certain point that they have to learn not to use the word cult because it's
polarizing, divisive.
It's derogatory, and of course, LDS members will know that, in the broader evangelical society, LDS is viewed as a cult. It's really a word that means any form of religion that is
that you don't like.
Yeah, you don't like. Exactly.
A cult is a religion I don't like.
Exactly. Yes.
In fact, many belief systems and traditions that today we consider religions were called cults when they first emerged. Let's head to the thought bubble. In the 1820s, a man named Joseph Smith said he was visited by an angel. The angel led him to unearth a golden book written in a language Smith called Reformed Egyptian. In 90 days, he translated it using special stones, gave the gold book back to the angel, and published all 588 pages. He called it the Book of Mormon, and with it, he started the Latter-day Saints movement. After the locals got wind of his teachings, he was killed by an angry mob. But the Latter-day Saints movement didn't die with Smith. It spread and grew at first on the margins and then more mainstream. By 1972, historian Sidney Ahlstrom wrote, "One cannot even be sure whether it is a sect, a mystery cult, a new religion, a church, a people, a nation, or an American subculture. Indeed, at different times and places, it is all of these." Whatever it's called, 200 years and millions of believers later, the Latter-day Saints Church isn't the fringe movement it was when it started.
And so it's interesting that John DeLynn, he invites someone like that on there because he also invites Stephen Hassan to his show, who promotes the Bite model. But those are a series of scholars who they show that, like, the cult models, brainwashing, mind control, they're not valid. The second one is Dr. Hillel Gray. He's a religious studies professor. This last guy, his name's David Frankfurter. He's a historian. He's studied the history of anti-cult movements. And now we'll get into my PowerPoint where I will elaborate on what they just talked about. on the history of the anti-cult movement and why it's problematic. And I'll go into the sources that Dan McClellan cited as well on the court cases where the anti-cult movement actually lost big. So in this presentation, I'm going to be doing a lot of appealing to authority. I'm not going to do a lot of in-depth breaking down their arguments because that would take too long. A lot of people might accuse me of a fallacious argument. However, appealing to authority is not a fallacy as long as it meets these two criteria. This authority, he or she, must have gained his or her expertise in a way that is publicly demonstrable and replicable by others. Others must be able to obtain the same expertise and arrive at the same conclusion if they so desire. The authority must contribute to a consensus of experts. If an expert's observations are open to public scrutiny, his or her conclusions are replicable, and his or her conclusions are replicable, a consensus of opinion will form. So if anyone wants to go like real in-depth into this issue, these are two great books that they can read. The Brainwashing, Reality or Myth by Massimo Introvigne. He is an Italian sociologist and social historian. It's like only like 90 pages, but it was published by the Cambridge University Press very recently in 2022, where he goes into the history of the concept of brainwashing. And then a historical introduction to the study of new religious movements by Michael Ashcraft was published by Routledge in 2018. It's considered the definitive study of new religious movements and the anti-cult movement. This is where I'm primarily getting my information from. However, if you don't want to buy books, you can go to more accessible places. Or Dan McClellan, he mentioned the Journal of Nova Religio. It's a peer-reviewed journal that is sponsored by the University of California Press. And then there is also the Journal of the Center for the Studies of New Religions, or the Journal of Cessner for short. So the study of new religious movements is basically divided into two camps. There is cultic studies, which is what Stephen Hassan is part of. And then there is NRM studies, or new religious movement studies. Now, which field is more respected in academia? So both fields study new and emerging secular and religious groups that are viewed with suspicion by wider society. But new religious movement studies tries to study these movements objectively and scientifically by observing how they start, form, recruit, grow, change, and react to outside pressures over time. Cultic studies, on the other hand, they hyper-focus on studying how these groups harm their members and society. So here's a list of cultic studies scholars: John Clark, Richard Delgado, Arthur Dole, Linda Dubrow Marshall, Steve Enroth, Lorna Goldberg, William Goldberg, David Halperin, Stephen Kent, Michael Langone, Richard Ofshay, Daniel Shaw, Margaret Singer, and Stephen Hassan. Richard Ofshay, Margaret Singer, and Stephen Hassan will be the ones that we will be talking about primarily. And then new religious movement scholars are Dick Anthony, William Bainbridge, Eileen Barker, James Beckford, David Bromley, Gordon Melton, James Richardson, Anson Shoup, Rodney Stark, Douglas Cohen, Eugene Gallagher, Massimo Introvigne, Stuart Wright, Gene Rosenfield, Braun Taylor, Jeffrey Kaplan, and Benjamin Zeller. Now, this is just a small sample of all the scholars. There's more, but this is just a small list of the people who are involved in these studies. So which field is more respected in academia? Now, the book that I talked about earlier by Michael Ashcraft, the A Historical Introduction to the Study of New Religious Movements, this is a quote from that book. It says, "Cultic studies is not mainstream scholarship. It is largely the project shared by a small cadre of committed scholars. They share their agenda with anti-cult activists, but the larger academic community, nationally and internationally, does not recognize cultic studies as the field that provides modern society with the most reliable information and interpretations of new religious movements. That distinction goes to NRM studies, or new religious movement studies." And if you want, you can go to these different journal articles. Does mental slavery exist? It's kind of like a condensed version of that book by Massimo Intervigne on brainwashing. This is an older article that was written in the 90s as well, but it's also a good one on the history of brainwashing. And then this one by James Richardson. It's a social psychological critique of brainwashing about the recruitment of new religions. It's also a good one. The reason why I included it is because it talks about how, cult studies scholars will often accuse these groups of brainwashing their followers. But what Richardson points out is that if they're brainwashing their followers to stay and not leave, then why do the vast majority of members end up leaving the group? And what he points out is that, like, most people, they join and they leave really quickly. Very few people actually end up staying for long periods of time in these groups. The groups like Unification Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, there's a few others that they tend to be like these very, very high control, very high demand groups and religions, and they tend to fizzle out very quickly as well. They don't last very long. And so if that's the case, then how is it that they're so powerful? How can they brainwash their followers if it's kind of like a revolving door? They can't have this power to brainwash their followers if so many people are joining and leaving. It's only a small percentage of people that actually join and stay for long periods of time. And so if they stay for long periods of time, it must be because they choose to, and they actually find something in the group that benefits them. It isn't because the leader or the organization is brainwashing them. And so I'd recommend reading that. And then this article by Benjamin Zeller, The Cult of Trump, What Cult Rhetoric Actually Reveals. Stephen Hassan's most recent book is actually entitled The Cult of Trump. And he argues that the Trump and his followers are a literal cult. And he tries to use his research to prove that. And Benjamin Zeller, he's no fan of Trump. A lot of scholars in the new religious movement studies, they are very left-wing, and so they don't like Trump. But they still argue that the cult rhetoric and cult models are not a good way to understand any movement, even if they happen to disagree with them. That is also a very good article. However, if you simply type in the title of the article in Google, you won't be able to find it. So you'll actually have to go to the Religion and Politics website and type in the title of the article into the search engine of the website if you want to read that. Here in comes the American Psychological Association. So what happened is that there were several former members of these new religious movements that weren't very popular, like Scientology, the Unification Church, former members that had left, or the families of these former members that were claiming that they did not join these groups of their own free will and choice, and that they were brainwashed, and they ended up recruiting these social scientists and sociologists and psychologists like Margaret Singer as expert witnesses to testify in court to say that they were brainwashed. Anytime you try to argue for something scientific in court, you bring on an expert witness. And so Margaret Singer and Richard Offshay both were the expert witnesses arguing that brainwashing should be a legitimate concept that can be argued in court. And if you can argue that brainwashing is a legitimate thing that can be argued in court, then these groups like Scientology can be sued for coercing these people to join their religion. And so what the courts did is they said, okay, you, Margaret Singer and Richard Offshay, that you have to basically make this brief, and you have to justify brainwashing. You have to show that it's a legitimate concept. And so they did. And then they also brought in the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association to evaluate Singer and Offshay's model to see if it was legitimate. So in the U.S. legal system, an amicus brief is an independent entity or individual who spontaneously submits to the court elements that it believes may be relevant to resolve a case. On the 10th of February, 1987, the American Psychological Association and others filed an amicus curiae brief in the Mokel case. The brief stated that the theory Margaret Singer had labeled coercive persuasion, which is synonymous with brainwashing, is not accepted in the scientific community, and that the corresponding methodology has been repudiated by the scientific community. The brief went on to specify that the choice of labels among brainwashing, mental manipulation, and coercive persuasion, always in the meaning used by Singer, was irrelevant, for none of those theories could be considered to be scientific. And then I'll go into what specific social scientists that were part of this APA task force said. So Dr. Jeffrey D. Fisher wrote that the report is unscientific in tone and biased in nature, sometimes characterized by the use of deceptive, indirect techniques of persuasion and control, the very thing it is investigating. At times, the reasoning seems flawed to the point of being almost ridiculous. Fisher added that the historical excursion on the cults reads more like hysterical ramblings than a scientific task force report. Fisher commented that the reasoning becomes absolutely some of the most polemical, ridiculous reasoning I've ever seen anywhere, much less in the context of an APA technical report. An Israeli scholar, Dr. Benjamin Biet Halami, although a scholar who was sympathetic to the anti-cult camp, ended with the radical conclusion: the term brainwashing is not a recognized theoretical concept and is just a sensationalist explanation more suitable to cultists and revival preachers. It should not be used by psychologists since it does not explain anything. And then according to Dr. Catherine Grady, the coercive persuasion techniques used in the task force estimate by the religious movements are not defined and cannot be distinguished from methods used in advertising, elementary schools, mainline churches, Alcoholics Anonymous, and Weight Watchers. So this is important because one of the main goals of cult models is to separate legitimate organizations from nefarious or illegitimate organizations. And so if one of the criticisms from respected scholars is that you can't distinguish between regular organizations and cults as defined by Margaret Singer using the models that they came up with, then of what use are your models? And so basically your models are useless if you can't do what your models claim they're supposed to do. We've gone to critiques of the anti-cult movement, which is what Stephen Hassan is a part of. We've gone over their history, the general history. And so if you go to Stephen Hassan's dissertation, he cites Margaret Singer and Richard Offshay extensively. That's what he bases his work on. So the critiques of them by the American Psychological Association apply to him and his work as well. So from his dissertation, this is a part, I've read it, and it says, although the bite model has served people for 30 years, it was created in 1988 to exit controlling relationships and groups. This is the first quantitative study. Doing this quantitative study offers a scientific basis that might prove useful for examining undue influence in judicial settings. Now, this should come off as a red flag for pretty much anyone who reads this, is his model has been around since 1988. And originally it was his model was just based off of, his interviews of people who have left new religious movements, and not just people who have left, but people who have a major axe to grind against the religion that they left. And that is one of the criticisms against the cultic studies field of research, is that they tend to give priority to people who have left and not to people who stay or people in the religion. They even view people who stay with suspicion. And even people who have left but aren't mad at their former religion, they even view them with suspicion. They've even been known to try to, once they realize that, they've left their religion, but they still have positive feelings towards them, they tend to be hostile towards those people as well. So it's kind of interesting. If you read the books I cited, they have a history of being hostile towards even those people, which kind of shows the lack of objectivity in their research. So what's also interesting is that after Singer and Afshay were rebuffed by the APA in the courts, and this happened several times, it wasn't just in one court case, they ended up breaking off from mainstream academia and kind of creating their own journals, creating their own little scholarly community. And basically they claimed that there was like a conspiracy against them in mainstream academia to kind of suppress their work. Now, you can either believe them, that there is a conspiracy against them, or you can believe mainstream academia and basically come to the conclusion that no one takes them seriously because their work isn't that great. You can choose who you want to believe, but I choose to side with the academic consensus. Now, I also have an acquaintance, I won't name him, but he is very involved in the religious studies circles. He recently graduated from Harvard, and he actually interacted with Stephen Hassan, had lunch with him. He had a Zoom call with him as well. And this is direct quotes from Stephen Hassan that he told me about. When asked about Massimo Intervigne and all these new religious movement scholars that don't respect his work and the work of other cult studies researchers, he said, Massimo Intervigne and et al. Are cult apologists and propagandists. No one should read or trust their work, which is a very black and white way to view people who disagree with you. Like usually in academia, if someone disagrees with you, you're very respectful. You try to offer grace towards them. When scholars disagree with you, you have a very respectful back and forth, and that's what you do in scholarly disagreements. But that's not what he does. It just shows the kind of attitude he has. Another thing he said when he found out that my acquaintance studies with Diana Eck, who is a professor of comparative religion at Harvard, he said, "Oh, you work with Diana Eck? I offered to present on mind control for her, but she said she wasn't at all interested in my work." So there's that. I always get frustrated with religious scholars, or really anyone, who refuse to understand the sociological and psychological dimensions of mind control from a scientific perspective. So another example of a respected religious studies scholar who doesn't take his work seriously and refuses to let him lecture in her classrooms, shows how much people take him seriously. I'm being serious when a lot of these cultic study scholars, the only places that they are taken seriously is within their own little niche, their own little group, and among lay people, because they're very popular among, obviously ex-Mormons and ex-members of other religions, non-specialists and non-experts who find their work appealing because it confirms their biases. It makes their former religion look bad. And so, of course, they're going to like their research, but that doesn't mean that it's true. And so, but the people who, like the American Psychological Association and other scholars, obviously don't respect their work. And another thing that my acquaintance said is that Hassan conflates his own progressive humanism as the standard for measuring healthy religion. And that's another thing, is that what Hassan and many other people who agree with him is that they say, because your religion doesn't meet this list of criteria that agree with my identity politics, then it must be harmful. Whereas, instead of actually assessing whether or not their religion is harmful, they just think, well, this religion doesn't agree with my identity politics, therefore I assume that it's harmful. They don't actually try to look at the results that the religion produces. And here's a few other specific critiques of Stephen Hassan from other social scientists. So sociologist David Bromley, he called Stephen Hassan's whole shtick a moral crusade. And he also said, you get people who are caught up in trying to change themselves, become a new person, or build a new world, and they lose touch with who they are. And that isn't to say some groups don't take advantage of that process. But I don't think it's necessarily the case that they need someone like Hassan to come in with predetermined answers to their life problems. And what he's talking about there is that Stephen Hassan, he offers something called exit counseling for people who are trying to leave new religious movements. And quite often, a lot of those people don't even want to leave those movements. It's their families who are trying to get them to leave these movements. And so they hire people like Hassan to do like these counseling sessions with them as a way to get them to leave, which many therapists would say that is unethical, because you're coming in with this predetermined notion that the goal is to get this person to leave. Whereas in real therapy, the goal is to, try and, you don't come in with this predetermined notion that to get this person to do anything. You're just trying to talk with this person, work with them, see what their goals are, and see where the conversation goes, obviously. But you don't have like a specific end goal in mind. Many therapists would say that is unethical. And then religious studies professor Eugene Gallagher says, there are explicit and implicit generalizations tend to foster, whether intended or not, generalized suspicion of all leaders who stand outside of an implied mainstream. Such generalized suspicion is a major analytical principle of anti-cult activists like Hassan and Singer. When raised to a higher level of generality, well-founded criticism of a few leaders is extended to all leaders with a corresponding loss of specificity, accuracy, and persuasiveness. Such overgeneralization ignores the abundant diversity of leadership forms of new religions on the assumption that all cults must be the same. And that is the problem, is that you have groups that obviously have done harm. Like you have the Branch Davidians in Texas. You have Jim Jones, that he convinced like hundreds of people to drink Kool-Aid to kill themselves. You have Heaven's Gate, where they all committed suicide. You obviously have groups that have done very, very harmful things, but Hassan claims that his model doesn't do this, but he ends up grouping religions like our religion in with those groups. And he tries to be nuanced, but if you look at how lay people, regular people interpret his model, they obviously don't interpret it that way. They think, oh well, the LDS Church meets the criteria of the Bite model, so therefore it's bad. And so it's exactly as Gallagher says, there's a loss of specificity, accuracy, and persuasiveness. And so you end up grouping people like Russell M. Nelson with someone like Jim Jones. And if you watched the Jubilee video, that's exactly what John DeLynn did. Is he said if you added up all the people that were killed by Mormonism, it would be more than the amount of people killed by Heaven's Gate, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because there's just more people in Mormonism. So you can't look at the absolute numbers that of people who have died in Mormonism. You have to look at the rate of people. And obviously Heaven's Gate killed more people if you look at the rate. Stephen Hassan can claim that he tries to be nuanced with his model, but you have people like John DeLynn using his model to try and group the LDS Church, our church, with people like Heaven's Gate, these crazy, absolutely insane groups that have done insane things. And so that kind of proves the point of Professor Gallagher here, that there's just a lack of nuance and a lack of specificity. And it ends up stigmatizing groups that shouldn't be stigmatized. And it causes groups like ours and other groups to be viewed with suspicion when they shouldn't be viewed with suspicion. They don't deserve it. And so it actually does a lot of harm to to groups that don't deserve it. So here's where the anti-cult movement has done a lot of harm. Now, luckily in the United States, because the courts were able to tell the anti-cult movement to basically knock it off, like you're not allowed to use brainwashing as a way to persecute these religions. We have some very robust religious freedom protections in the U.S., but that's not the case in other countries, especially in Europe and Asia. And that is why in 2020, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan commission of the U.S. federal government, they actually identified the anti-cult ideology as a major threat to international religious liberty. Now, the anti-cult movement's ability to infringe on the rights of minority religions in the U.S. has been severely weakened since the courts took away the brainwashing defense. But in Europe and Asia, the brainwashing argument is still admissible in many countries, and the anti-cult movement even has strong lobbying power in several countries, which has resulted in the persecution of several minority religions. For example, there is a group that goes by the acronym FECRIS, or it's also called the European Federation of Centers of Research and Information on Cults and Sects. It has members from all over Europe, some of which are secular people who think new religions are a threat to their country's secular norms. For example, countries like France is a very secular country, and so they view new religious movements as kind of a threat to their secular order. If these religions become too popular, then it could threaten their way of life, because they value secularism a lot. And this group, this anti-cult group called FECRIS, actually has a lot of power in the French government. I'm pretty sure that they even have like an office somewhere in the French government, and they're a very sketchy group. They've done a lot of really bad things that has resulted in the persecution of new religious movements all over Europe. Other members of FECRIS consist of clergy members of dominant religions in countries like Italy or Russia. So you have secular countries like France, but you also have countries like Italy or Russia where there is one dominant religion like Catholicism or the Russian Orthodox Church, who are very threatened by smaller religions like Jehovah's Witnesses or our church. They are threatened by them stealing their members, basically. And these dominant churches tend to have a lot of influence in the local and federal politics in these countries. And so they tend to have representation in this group, FECRIS, that have resulted in the persecution of smaller religions all over Europe. Specifically, there is a man, his name is Alexander Dvorkin. He's from Russia. He's a clergy member in the Russian Orthodox Church, and also a member of FECRIS. I'm pretty sure he's very high up in the leadership. And he is called our church, the LDS Church, a coarse, neo-pagan, occult sect with a fairly serious totalitarian tendencies. And he's even talked about, limiting our religious freedom. And he played a major role in getting the Jehovah's Witnesses getting kicked out of Russia, and our church having its ability to proselyte severely restricted in Russia. So a few years ago, the Jehovah's Witnesses got completely kicked out of Russia. They're not allowed to operate at all. And I remember talking to missionaries who served their mission in Russia during that time, and they recall people being dragged out of their homes by police. It was very scary times. Now, luckily, our church, we're much more willing to compromise with governments, and so the Russian government wasn't quite as mean to us. Jehovah's Witnesses tend to be less willing to compromise with governments, and that's gotten them in trouble with governments all over the world. Like, for example, they were put in concentration camps with Jews in Nazi Germany. Because of that, they don't believe in voting. They don't believe in cooperating with government at all. So that's just gotten them in trouble. And same thing here in Russia. But that is, at its very worst, that is something that the anti-cult movement has done. When they have the ability to do so, when when local and higher up government allows them to. That is what they have shown they are willing to do. And they use these cult models, very similar to that of Stephen Hassan's, as justification. These are legitimate religions. These are not, because they meet these, because they brainwash their followers and they meet this criteria, and so therefore they aren't legitimate religions. And so therefore they should not be allowed to operate in our country. That's the justification being used. And China uses something very similar. They have a list of countries that are not allowed to operate in their country, and they use the cult brainwashing models as their criteria for what religions are acceptable. Again, our faith, because we are much more willing to compromise and respect the laws, both China and Russia haven't been as heavy-handed with us, but that could change in the future, because we are viewed as a cult by some people, and so it depends on whether decisions change in the future, and so that could affect our fellow brothers and sisters in China and Russia and other places in Europe. And so we may not think that it affects us here in the States and in other places where we have stronger religious freedom protections, but the anti-cult ideology can do a lot of harm when there aren't robust religious freedom protections. If you want to read more about what's going on in Europe and Asia, these are some good articles to read that are in the Journal of Cesner. But that's the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
A few years ago, I don't know if you know about this, but there was a group here in Mexico. There was a restoration church. It was called the Light of the World. They had a few churches in California, I think. Have you heard of that group?
I don't think so.
Well, pretty much they have like an apostle. He's like the prophet. And they have some communities in some states here in Mexico. And currently he's in jail, the apostle. And he was like the Mexican Warren Jeffs. We could call it that. So I remember that this just happened a few years ago, and many people who left that church, they would quote Steve Hassan a lot. They would say, "Oh, the reason I realized I was in a cult, it was because of the bite model, right?" And they would say the behavior, the information control, the thought control, and emotional control. And I wanted to ask you a bit specifically about that model, the BITE and acronym, how people say it applies to the church, and maybe your thoughts on that. And people saying that, word of wisdom or modesty or things like that, they can influence the behavior. Or if you try to find information on the Kinderhook plates on the church's website, you maybe won't find anything. So that's information control and thoughts control. I don't know, maybe when people say if you maybe listen to criticisms, you will lose the spirit. So don't pay attention to that or things like that. Or emotional control, like, I don't know, if you don't feel the spirit while doing something, maybe you shouldn't be doing it, or things like that. Or if you don't think the church is true, pay attention to the spirit. So I've heard criticisms on those things, and I know that maybe the bite model and the cold model and things like that, like you said, is maybe it's too broad, and it's not very specific, or it joins religions with extremist groups. But I wanted just to ask you, what are your thoughts on how people describe the church using the BITE model?
Yeah, so the new religious movement scholars that I cited, they wouldn't deny that there are groups like the one that you just described. They would just say that the BITE model is not a good model to use to understand that group. And so, and they wouldn't deny that groups like that can't do harm. Quite often the accusation is, oh, so you don't think these groups do harm whenever you critique the BITE model, because these people think that the BITE model is the only framework you can use to analyze these groups. But obviously, like, especially when it comes to thought control, that's synonymous with brainwashing, especially thought and emotion control. And as we just learned, like, that's just not a thing. You can't brainwash people. Short of actual physical coercion or threats of physical coercion, as the articles in that book I just shared with you, you can't really get people to do your bidding with pure psychological coercion. You can force people to do it by, like, physically torturing them, as or like threatening to physically torture them. But you can't use, like, psychological techniques to get them to do your bidding, as Stephen Hassan claims, through mind control, which is what he is claiming in the thought control and emotion control type of thing.
Yeah, and maybe just a couple of questions. Maybe just to play devil's advocate, just trying to predict the reaction and just try to address some things that might be brought up. Let's see. Well, when you mentioned the Jubilee video and how the BITE model is quoted and things like, Mormonism has, if you count the people who have died because of Mormonism compared to people who have died and in Heaven's Gate, and the numbers are big and things like that. We've addressed some of that already. And I just wanted to ask you, some people would say, all right, so let's say the BITE model is not the best academic way to categorize religion. At the end of the day, I don't care about labels. It's still, Mormonism is still dangerous, and Mormonism still, I don't know, influences people to be, I don't know, religious fanatics, or the teachings on LGBTQ issues. I think John Dillon was focused on that on the Jubilee video. Like, all those things are still harmful. So whether we can call it a cult or not, it's harmful. So I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on maybe the idea that the church is dangerous regardless of the terminology we use?
Yeah, I'll use that as a way to address something that John said in the Jubilee video. So one thing that Cardin said is that, and it also agrees with something that I brought up, is that according to the BITE model, anything can be a cult. And what John said is that, Stephen Hassan acknowledges that the military can be a cult, all these other organizations can be a cult, but what you can use a harm continuum as a way to differentiate between groups that do meet the BITE model and the church that also meets the BITE model. And you can use this harm continuum as kind of like a tiebreaker. And my response to that is, okay, well, if you need a harm continuum as kind of like a tiebreaker between these groups and the church, then why do we need the model? Like, what use is the model? Why can't we just, throw away the model and just assess whether or not the church is harmful? And so that's something that I would respond to that. And if we're going to do that, then you're going to lose the argument, because as I also brought up in my response to the Jubilee video, there have been close to 160 studies that have been published between 1960 and 2022 on the subject of Mormonism and mental health, or just general health. And the vast majority of them show that there are positive results. That's true for women. That's true for ethnic minorities like Polynesians and Hispanic people as well. And it's also true for LGBTQ members of the church as well. Contrary to what John tried to argue in the Jubilee video. So there's a recent review of the literature that was conducted by some researchers at BYU that was published in 2022 that reviewed all the studies that had been conducted thus far. And what they found was that there are studies that do show that LDS, sexual minorities, or LGBTQ Latter-day Saints are like worse off. They have worse mental health, but those studies tend to have methodological flaws. And those studies tend to be conducted or co-conducted by John Dehlin. And they tend to have non-representative samples, and they tend to not have good comparison groups. And the studies that show that LDS sexual minorities that have better mental health than non-LDS Latter-day Saints, those studies tend to be much more rigorous. They tend to have proper comparison groups, and they have representative samples. They're much more better conducted than the studies that show that they're worse off. And so the best studies to date actually show that LGBTQ Latter-day Saints are better off. And so, yeah, if that's your argument, that like if we're going to trash the cult models and just throw your eggs in all the basket that the church is harmful, then you're going to lose that argument, because all the evidence points in the opposite direction. I used to think that, Stephen Hassan's bite model was valid, but that the LDS Church just didn't fit the criteria, and that these other groups, they did fit the criteria, but my church just didn't. The Jehovah's Witnesses, those weird groups over there, they do. The more I did my research, the more I realized that the model itself just isn't valid, and that we just need to trash it, and we need to use better ways to evaluate different religions. And it helped me look at different religions more charitably as well, like Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, other religions that I tend to view negatively. I tried to avoid using the word cult even for ideologies and groups that I don't like. That's what I would say to other members. Is it's quite often the reaction of members when they get the word cult hurled at them is to say, no, we're not a cult because we don't meet the criteria of the bite model. But the reaction should be, who is Stephen Hassan? Why should I respect his work? What has he done to be respected? And why should I listen to him at all? And so the people should inform themselves more on the history of the anti-cult movement and these cult models. And when they do, they'll realize that there's just no foundation behind them.